Hello and welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg, as usual, proudly powered by Research Luxembourg and recording at the Media Center of the University of Luxembourg. And in today's episode, our guest is Professor Phillip Dale, who is head of the Laboratory for Energy Materials at the University of Luxembourg. Phillip's research group has two focuses. The first focus is to make small photovoltaic devices for microsolar and semi-transparent applications. The second focus is on investigating the properties of new semiconductors for photovoltaic applications. Phillip, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so as our listeners already heard, we'll be talking a lot about solar energy, solar cells, solar panels, photovoltaic units. There are so many different names, and I never know whether there's one that is actually the correct one and everything is just common language or...
You're absolutely right. Language is a real issue in the solar cell world. There is a convention which we can go through, but I would say there's no real right or wrong. Things get used synonymously. I remember when I first entered the field, there were far too many TLAs, three-letter acronyms. We'll do a CBD with the CDS on the TCO. And you're like, what?
And it's not the case anymore? Or maybe you understand them now.
I understand it now.
So it's all okay, right?
It's all okay. But I try to take care.
That's very good. So we'll be talking about all of them. And I hope you will not say, oh, Hannah, you're incorrect because it's something.
No.
Very good. So solar cells, we're talking about that. And we're talking research. So I was just wondering, what is the research into solar cells more about? Is it more efficiency or is it more cost or maybe something else?
Yes, and yes. It's about all three. The dominant discussion is around efficiency. So I think we should discuss efficiency. This is if we put a certain amount of light onto our solar cell, we will get a certain amount of electrical energy back. So it's the ratio of the electrical energy that we get out divided by the light energy that we put in, multiplied by 100. This is the efficiency. And we would like this number to be as high as possible. Because for a given area or a given amount of material, you want to receive as much energy as possible. So the main drive in research is to get as high efficiency as possible. And just to put a number around that, then the dominant product on the market is a silicon photovoltaic panel. And the world record currently stands at 27%. So that's just over a quarter of the light is converted to electrical energy. This might not sound like a lot, but the theoretical limit is 32%. So actually we're reaching the engineering limits for a single solar cell. Now in the future, we would like to improve the efficiency still further. And so we have researchers focusing on different ways to break this theoretical limit. So the theoretical limit is named after a pair of scientists, Shockley-Queisser. It's called the Shockley-Queisser limit. And as I said, it stands at 32%. And now here in Luxembourg and in other places around the world, we try to think of concepts to break this limit. In Luxembourg, in our labs, we work on two concepts. One is called the tandem solar cell. This is where we actually stack one solar cell on top of another solar cell. And the top solar cell takes the high energy photons of light. I guess we'll talk about that later. So it takes the blue color, let's say, and the bottom solar cell takes the red and infrared light. And in this way, we can use the sun's energy more efficiently and we can extract more electrical energy. So this is the one way. And a second approach that we have is to take a lens and concentrate the light onto a small solar cell. So we take a big area, take the light from this big area, and we focus it down onto a small solar cell. And every time we increase the amount of light by a factor of 10, we increase the efficiency of the solar cell by 2%. And then another advantage is, of course, instead of having this much, a large area of solar cell or solar panel, we can reduce the size smaller.
So you have two methods that you're focusing on, and it always makes me think, how does it start? Why do you choose these methods? Is it just you get specialists that are more into that field, or you have some hunch that, oh, this probably is a method we should follow?
Why do we do what we do? That's a wonderful question. And sometimes we start research lines and then we realize after 5 years that it's in fact no good and we have to start over.
But at least you've proven that,
and
which is
we've
important.
proved it, or you've put enough time in and you've hit your head against the brick wall so much that it now begins to hurt and you just have to swap. But sometimes it can be about what you can physically do yourself. Maybe you don't have the resources or the equipment to play the game that you want to play, but you have to, in English we have the phrase, to cut your cloth accordingly. You have to play the game that you can with the resources that you have, where you think you can make the biggest difference. If you're competing against super huge labs with large teams, multi-million euro equipment, yes, you can still have a brilliant idea, but you may not be able to execute as well.
Yeah, good point. I think, we should be trying to be a lion, but at the same time remembering we're Luxembourg. So I think that's
I mean, please, Luxembourg is extremely well funded. I'm very happy with our laboratories. We have excellent equipment. Of course, we can always have more. I mean, I will never say no to more toys, but to be in the photovoltaic business, it is a multi-million euro business. It is, simply put, expensive. It's not like other types of science, I would say. It's a technology, in fact. PV is a stack of sciences that sit on top of one another, which makes me an expert in nothing and a jack of all trades, I would say.
It's a good quality, probably.
We need every quality.
Totally. Okay, leaving the qualities aside, you mentioned those two kind of lines of research, but I think maybe, as usual, I'm starting from the end, and maybe we should start from the beginning. So just say, how does a normal, if we can use that word, solar cell look like? So what is it made of? You said silicon, that's the classic thing?
So, I mean, we can either start, we can start from a materials side, which is easier. So we see on the roof these black squares or black rectangles. And I like to think about them as sandwiches. In fact, most of my science analogies come to food in the end. But in this case, we can think about a burger or a sandwich. So this module, we call it a photovoltaic module, and it sits on the roof, and it's a sandwich. So the top, the bread, if you will, the buns are pieces of glass. And then in the middle, at the heart of the sandwich, we have what we call silicon wafers. So these are single crystals sliced very thin, and they're normally about 15 centimeters across, and they're square-ish. And these are the solar cells that convert light into electricity. Now, in between the bread and the solar cells, we have another layer, which is called the encapsulation layer, which is critical. These are polymer films which glue everything together, and they stop water and oxygen coming inside of the module, because this will degrade the performance over time. So there's the basics of the photovoltaic module. So the module then consists of maybe 20 to 30 to 40 silicon wafers. And these are what we call the solar cells inside the photovoltaic module.
So that's the material side.
Yeah, that's the material side. And now you would like the more understanding side. So I find it quite useful to first just discuss current and voltage. So when we discuss electrical current, this is the flow of electrons through a wire. The analogy we can think about is water flowing through a pipe. So then we can think about the rate of flow, so liters per second. And in current, we discuss electrons per second. And now the other one is voltage, and this we can equate to pressure. So how much pressure is actually pushing those electrons along. So now let's move back to the solar cell. We can think about the solar cell, the silicon, and inside the silicon, like every material, there are electrons, and they sit normally at a low energy level. And now light comes from the sun. Light is actually energy. It's a little bit of energy. And a little bit of energy hits one of the electrons in the silicon, and it raises up to a highly excited state. And now in the highly excited state, it can actually leave the silicon, let's say, through the top contacts. It can then go and do some useful work. As it does the useful work, it reduces its energy level, and it will come back through the wires to the back of the silicon wafer, and it will enter at the back into the low energy level again. So the light acts like a little pump to push the electron from the low energy level to the high energy level. So now talking about the current and the voltage again, the current is the number of electrons we can push out of the solar cell. And this difference in energy level is in fact the voltage that we can apply when we do the useful work. And we often discuss power, and power is current multiplied by voltage. So what we're trying to do is optimize for the highest power, and therefore we have to play a little bit with the current and the voltage. So that's the basic understanding of photovoltaic.
That was very clear. Thank you very much. And I already have to tell the listeners that if they are interested in Phillip explaining things, there are a few things on the web that you can find as well, some videos that you make, because believe it or not, of course, believe it because you can hear it. Phillip is also doing a lot of science communication and trying to explain the world to people, so you can check that out. Coming back first to the materials, we said silicon, but it's not always silicon, right?
It's not always silicon. What's important is to have something called a semiconductor. And a semiconductor, as the name suggests, semi-conducting, it falls between insulators, so something like glass or rubber is non-conducting, no electrons can flow, and metals, of course, everything flows through a metal. Semiconductors will flow the electrons, as discussed, but you need to input a little bit of energy, and this can be heat, or it can be light. And in the case of photovoltaic modules, it's light. And that's the discussion where, as I said, the light energy comes in and it picks up an electron and chucks it up to the high energy level. And the high energy level is a bit like on the Autobahn, where the lower energy level is like you're in a traffic jam, and the upper energy level is like where the road is completely clear and you see the cars whizzing past. That's a bit how I explain it to the students. And I forgot your question.
No problem. I just said that it's not only silicon. So you said it has to be a semiconductor.
It has to be a semiconductor. So the semiconductor, it requires light to take an electron from the low energy level to the high energy level, and then it can flow out. So we need this energy stimulus. Now, there are other materials we could use, like cadmium telluride or copper indium gallium selenide. In fact, most semiconductors will work to some extent. But what we're looking for is very special properties in the semiconductor. Only certain semiconductors have the right properties to work in photovoltaic panels. And one of these properties is called the band gap. And this is the difference in energy from the low level to the high level. Now, if you remember, I said power was important. So you could think about it in two ways. You could make the energy gap really, really large, but then you would get a high voltage, but very little current, because you would only take photons of light from the blue spectra of the sun. Then there aren't many. So then the current would be low, but the voltage would be high. On the other hand, you could say, I want to take all the photons I can, so then I make the energy gap very small, and I use the blue light, I use the visible light, I use the infrared light. But the energy gap then, because the photons of infrared only allow a small jump in height from low to high, then the energy gap is small, so the voltage is small. So now you have a high current and a small voltage. So again, power is current times voltage. So you have these two extremes when you're aiming for somewhere in the middle where you get enough current and enough voltage, and the product gives you the maximum value.
And that's also why you're researching the idea of stacking two solar panels.
Right, exactly.
Together.
So if we stack two solar panels, we can take the high energy light and use it with a big gap. And then the low energy light just passes through as if the top cell is there. So for the infrared and red light, the top cell is invisible and just passes straight through. And then it gets absorbed in the lower solar cell. And then we can use that energy again in a more efficient way.
Okay, before we talk also about the funneling, as I am imagining it, so the other kind of research subject, I think it's the moment, I'm looking at the clock, is the moment to look at the pub quiz question that is related to the place where we're sitting, so Luxembourg. So as usual, if you can ask the question right now, and listeners, remember the answer only at the end of the podcast.
Right, so my pub quiz question is, it's really a guessing game, I guess. If we in Luxembourg wanted to go 100% renewable, given our current energy demands, how much of the surface of Luxembourg would we have to cover in photovoltaic panels? And we can express that as a percentage. So is it 1%, 5%, 10%, 50%, 200%? I think it's an intriguing question, because it would be nice to be self-sufficient or close to self-sufficient.
It's a brilliant question, especially because I'm very, very fascinated about the energy model in Luxembourg and how much we get from abroad, right? So let's look into that in a second. As I said, a couple of minutes rather. the solution will be there, and we'll be talking a little bit more about it. But now coming back to the ideas that you're researching in your lab, what I was thinking of, again, I'm trying to imagine how this stacking would work and how this kind of, how did you call it?
Light concentration.
Light concentration would work from an aesthetic perspective as well. Because we all know that one of the, I guess, problems or issues, or how you want to call it, of social acceptance of solar panels is the way they look.
I think you are exactly right. And this is why we have started a project with Professor Catherine Jones in the geography department, actually to start looking at social acceptance here in Luxembourg. I love it. There's a really great collaboration where we actually try and, Professor Jones asks the public and selected stakeholders how they feel about PV in general, and what about coloured PV, and whether if we put it on the sides of buildings or into the urban infrastructure, whether they would mind, whether they would notice, and whether it should blend in or should it just look like its normal black self. So this, I think, is a really important line of research, which is critical for the energy transition. And it's something that I, as a physical scientist in my laboratory, I cannot answer. So I make a lot of assumptions in the lab, like I believe that people will want colored PV. And I believe that maybe it should be patterned or be able to put a picture on it. But I have not gone out of my laboratory to test these hypotheses. And Professor Jones will do that, actually. They're going to create tools where people will be able to visualize different types of PV in different environments and be able to pass comment on it. I think it's a really fantastic idea.
And there's also an ongoing survey right now that we are going to share the link to in the show notes. So listeners, if you're interested, of course, we'll be more than happy if you participate and give us your opinion about it, because it's really important that as many participate as possible.
That's very true. Apparently in Luxembourg, you need at least 1,000 answers for it to have some statistical significance.
Yes, and when you mentioned that, I already thought about an episode I had a couple of months ago. It was a researcher from LIST, Tim Huber. We were talking about sustainable materials and exactly this kind of a struggle of many engineers being very proud of their sustainable materials. But then actually when you go to the general public, the opinions are not always very favorable, unfortunately.
That is a worry. If I'm completely honest, there is in Oxfordshire in England at the moment a very big protest movement called stopbotlywest.com. And you see that people have great fear and anxiety that the landscape within which they live will change. So for the last 200 years, we have not really seen our energy landscape. We have had these very large power stations hidden away, and then we just get these wires coming across the landscape. And we don't see our energy infrastructure. So today we know if we look out the window in the right direction, we see 3 or 4 little puffs of smoke from Cattenom. That is our energy infrastructure. Although interestingly, that electricity never reaches Luxembourg. We take all our electricity from Germany, actually. But in the future, if we as a society wish to go renewable, we will start to see our energy infrastructure. It will intrude into our visual landscape. And the question is, should we try and camouflage it, or will we need to camouflage it? Or as a society, we could say, we don't want to see our energy infrastructure. I'd rather we put it in some other country, and it's their problem.
It just reminds me, I'm sure that many of our listeners go on trips to Trier, for example, in Germany. When you cross the border, you have a kind of a big field of solar panels.
That's right.
And I always kind of analyze my reaction to it, whether I actually like it or not, what is my feeling. And I have to say that me personally, I don't find it very beautiful.
Right. So my feeling is that we need to put the photovoltaic panels or energy generation sources that we choose, and I believe that PV is the best, on the buildings and in the locations that we actually use. So we need to make sure that every human urban building surface is generating energy for us so that we don't have to use the green land for this energy generating purpose. I think there are cases where it makes sense to put PV on green land, but as a general perspective, we should try and minimize this.
Are we talking also about different efficiency if you put it in urban context or not?
Efficiency is efficiency. The PV module will not change efficiency, but what will change is the amount of light that hits the surface of the panel. So in the public conscience, we all know that the PV panel should face south at some angle approximately 30 degrees. And this is what we have been trained. And this probably came about because PV was rather expensive. It's now rather cheap. In fact, it's the cheapest source of energy you can have. And it's the fastest growing source of energy on the planet. We've never actually changed energy more rapidly than we have now. What the calculations and experience shows is you can actually put the panels on your east side of the roof and the west side of the roof. And even if you put it north facing, essentially you generate 60% of the power that you would if you had put it on the south facing. What that means is, in the long run, actually is you will still generate more electricity than it took to make the panel. So you will still be ahead. It will just take longer to get there. So the advice is still probably east, west, south. But there have been some recent calculations I saw at a conference last year, which showed in Europe you can also put solar panels on the sides, so the facades of the buildings, south, east and west facing, and we will still come out ahead. We will make more energy than it actually took to produce the modules. So my suggestion is that we try and cover our buildings where feasible and where it makes sense, so not hiding them in shadows. This makes no sense. But if the building is in sufficient daylight for long enough, then we do need to put them on the sides of the buildings.
But then we would probably need something that is colorful, as we were saying.
Exactly, which is why we have this wonderful project running where we are attempting to color our solar panels as much as possible without losing energy. Now, there is a balance to be had. So a normal PV panel looks black. What does it mean? The light comes from the sun, it hits the PV panel, most is absorbed, and only a few photons of light then get to your eye, so you observe the object. Now, if you would like it to be colored, that means I have to take some of the photons of light that were going into the panel and making energy, I now have to use them to generate a color to put into my eyeball. So we will reduce slightly the energy yield, and yet there are some wonderful technologies out there which give a very convincing color, but we only relatively lose about 10% of the energy yield. So rather than making 100 units of energy, we would make 90 units of energy.
And can we talk about any color, or there will be preferred colors in this case?
Now we move into the world of architects. And I have discovered that architects rule the world. I never knew this before I started this project, but it turns out that when we build buildings, we normally employ an architect. And the architect will produce some drawings and suggest some textures or colors. But not many of us have ever argued with an architect and said, but why have you not considered this or that, right? They are, in fact, the masters of style for our society, silently, and I never knew it. So if they do not suggest a PV facade, we will never get a PV facade, right? And very interestingly, and I hope Professor Jones forgives me if I say this, because in fact it's her finding, and we will check, when she has a wonderful workshop where she has a miniature version of a differdange, or a village, I think Beche, in Luxembourg, and people are given stickers. Where would you like to put the PV? You have to put more PV. Everybody sticks it on the roof. Nobody, not even the town planners or the architects or the professionals, ever sticks it on the side of the building. So we are so conditioned that it must go on the roof. And we need to change that.
Next time I will participate in the workshop and I will just stick it all on the walls.
You take those stickers and you stick them everywhere.
I'm ready. Here I come. And it's funny you're saying that you probably are not aware my mother is an architect. So I'm definitely going to play that part to her.
Please.
She will be very pleased.
Ask her, yeah.
about architects ruling the world. I mean, she will definitely be pleased. When I was preparing for this interview, I noticed that it was color, but also the idea of actually making them transparent.
Right.
Is that possible, really?
That is possible. We have some in the lab.
Okay.
So the photovoltaic module should capture as much light as possible, but you can think of applications where you have a lot of surface and you would also like to see. And there were two ways to solve this problem. The first way that researchers tried is they tried to make this solar cell material very, very thin, for example. And this gave a kind of browny light. It's not very nice. And then a second way of actually doing it is to make the solar cells so small that when you space them apart, when you stand a certain distance away, you cannot differentiate them. So then it just looks like you're looking through sunglasses. You basically have something called a neutral density filter. That means all the light from all the individual colors is coming through the glass, but just less photons are hitting your eye. And this approach is the approach that we are taking in a European research project that we have.
Soon it will be either all colorful on the walls, as we said, or very, very transparent, so you won't even notice.
Exactly.
As I mentioned in the beginning, you're also a very avid science communicator and telling our listeners about loads of different things today, but also in your videos and other communication projects. And I was just wondering, as a fellow communicator, what is the most difficult part for you when you want to communicate, your science to the general public? Well, what do you find the most difficult?
That's a great question. So in general, I wear two hats. Or I wear three hats, even. With one hat, I'm a researcher. Then in my second hat is the photovoltaic teams in the physics department around 2017, when Donald Trump got elected. We said, we have to do something. I mean, it is not enough to research. We now need to reach out to the general public. We need to start to try and change public opinion. We need the politicians to get involved, and therefore we have to push public opinion. So we started to try and think of things and ideas that we could push to the general public related to energy to help them think more about renewable energy and the climate crisis. So I would say this discussion is very difficult for the general public because there are certain key concepts and language which is simply missing from the school education and also in the media when it's debated. It's more or less, what do you feel about nuclear, or what do you feel about this? And that is a little bit the issue. Decisions are made on feelings normally and not on hard numbers. And so we try to push a language that is understandable and to give people a feeling, for example, what's the energy cost of driving by car to work versus going by bicycle? This is really important. And this stuff is very far from the research that I do in my lab, where I'm discussing electrons and grain size and texture and Raman data, and it's super far away. But I still feel like the communication to the public on the general topics is very important. Having said all of that, in my third hat, I am a scientific coordinator and advisor of the Physics Scientines Lab. The Scientines is a great concept from Elizabeth John at the LCSB, where she said we need to give school students a university experience or a research experience. And this started in biology, and now there's also some in math and computing, and there's one in physics. And I'm the physics coordinator. And there, actually, we have several different workshops on renewable energy, on sun cream, actually, which is a great one. But one of the subjects is solar cells. And there, the students actually get the chance to build a solar cell and then use some of the equipment I actually use in my lab.
So your toys, as you call them.
Yeah, my toys, to make a measurement. So in some respects, the research is very far away, but nonetheless, we still aim to give the students an experience of the research.
So what do you think? Is it more the experience that is lacking, that people don't understand what we're trying to tell them, or it's the vocabulary?
That's a great question. And now we run into the world of human behavior. So, as I discussed with you before we began the podcast, my greatest issue is that I know that climate change is real. I feel it and I can observe it in my day to day. I mean, it is not like the weather this year is normal, right? And 2 years ago, it was not normal that the leaves on the trees turned brown in late July and August. So I think as humans, we can all feel that something is wrong. And now I have to convince you there are things that we can do to change our behavior that would help slow down climate change. And eventually we can try and go the other way and try and actually reduce it so we get to net zero carbon emissions. So I know this is critically important, and my job is to try and persuade people of this, but in such a way that I don't make them scared or that they think I'm a complete lunatic. The analogy is when I was a child, there used to be people on Saturday morning outside the shops preaching about the end of the world or something similar. And then everybody used to walk around with a big 20-meter radius around them. And this is what we need to avoid. So we need to keep people engaged, make them understand, and somehow we need to gently try and change human behavior. And I know that it is hard because I find it hard myself sometimes. So there have been changes I have made to my life, which have reduced my carbon emissions. And I have photovoltaics on my roof, and I have an electric car.
Not on the walls.
Not the walls, unfortunately. Sorry. But the life, it's a balance. We have on the one hand the things that we do, which cost energy or cost carbon. And on the other hand, then we have these renewable energy technologies, which can generate the energy in a clean way. And we would make our lives much easier if our energy footprint or carbon footprint was smaller than it was today. And if you really would like to think about this and just move slightly outside of the box, Luxembourg's energy consumption is twice that of an average European, and it is 3 times that of a citizen of the world. So now, which is it? Would we like everybody to have the same opportunities as us? So the average citizen of the world should actually have 3 times more energy. Where are we going to find this energy from? We even struggle to replace our current energy system and our current demands, which are 75% fossil fuel based. And now we say we would like everybody in the world to have the same opportunity. And now we have to do that another factor of 3. This will simply be impossible.
So if you're saying 2 times, 3 times, do you know what is the biggest problem there? What should we start with our energy reduction?
Well, there's the issue is we don't think it's a problem. We like it. We're addicted to energy. We love it. It makes our lives more convenient.
What is striking to me is that, having traveled to loads of European or even other countries, I wouldn't really notice that much that Luxembourg is over-consuming energy.
So Luxembourg has the highest car ownership per capita. The cars are also bigger per capita. Luxembourgers on average take 6 flights a year. Swedish people take 1.6 times a year. The issue is money, in the sense that if you have money, you spend it. If you spend it, you normally consume energy. There are very few tasks or very few activities you can do where you spend money and you don't then use energy or use materials. Of course, everybody likes having money and it makes our lives super comfortable, but it is also the largest driver of energy expenditure.
Makes me think of a video I saw that you made with your, is it niece or?
It was my niece.
Yes,
yeah.
With your niece, where you're exactly talking about doing something without energy.
Right.
It's a very good one, actually. It kind of makes us realize that it's so omnipresent, because we, nowadays, because of all the discussions we have about climate and energy, we are more aware. But then again, there are certain things that we kind of don't link with energy as such, right?
Right. Yes. There are many activities in our lives that we do not even consider taking energy when in fact it does. And the one that really hit home to me recently was during a workshop. We had bought a new toy. Love the toys. You see, we bought something and we wasted energy because we bought it, but hopefully the demonstration will pay back on itself. So we have a hairdryer, a Föhn in Luxembourgish, to dry your hair. And it's a very small one. It's tiny, fits in your hand very easily. And normally we try and ask people to use our bike, which generates electricity to power the hairdryer. It's impossible, right? But recently we bought a big battery with some solar panels, and we charged the battery with the solar panels, and then we plugged in the hairdryer. And I turned it on, and the hairdryer worked. Brilliant. And you just waved it in front of your hand. And the power meter says 600 watts, which is about half that of an electric kettle, right, when you're cooking water. And I was not burning my hand at all. It was exactly the same feeling as if I'd breathed out from my mouth onto my hand. And it is insane how much energy it takes to heat. And we just really don't think about it, which was why the whole conversation 2 Christmases ago about Christmas lights in Luxembourg was so crazy to me. There were some discussion about should we have Christmas lights on or off. Light is extremely cheap, right? Just moving your car 200 meters down the road would be the same energy cost as running your LED Christmas lights for a whole month continuously, 24 hours a day. And yet we all carried on driving our cars as if we didn't care.
Great. Remember next time you put up all your Christmas lights, because it's sooner or later going to come. So you'll be thinking about what Phillip said. And I think the only thing that remains is to look at the pub quiz question. So we're coming back to Luxembourg. I'm very curious because I don't know the answer and I don't want to just have a blind guess. So tell us, first of all, what was the question and then what is the answer?
If we in Luxembourg wanted to go 100% renewable, given our current energy demands, how much of the surface of Luxembourg would we have to cover in photovoltaic panels? I first did this for myself because I didn't know the answer at all. And when I run the calculations myself, the answer comes out at about 10% land surface. So that means 1 in every 10 meters squared should be covered in a PV panel if we only put PV panels horizontally or at a slight angle. Of course, now if we put them on the side of buildings, we have generated new surface. So therefore, we would use less land surface. Now, some people are shocked by this number, so I give a little comparison. So Luxembourg currently covers 10% of its land surface with human-made structure. So the roads, the railways, the buildings, the playgrounds, the car parks. This is 10% already. And that is the 4th highest in Europe. For me, I would be very comfortable if we now put PV on our human structures. I think if we now cover another 10% of our land in PV, we will start to feel quite uncomfortable with this. Although, as I said before, there are some merits to agricultural PV. In fact, it's been proven that some crops actually grow better slightly in the shade. So you can actually get a win-win situation there.
We didn't mention that, so it's good that you actually said that too, because for me, when I learned about it, I don't know, 2-3 years ago, it was a novel thing. You know, I don't check all the developments in PV. Sorry, I have something else to do.
Really?
Yeah, from
Good
today,
Lord.
Obviously, every day. I'm going to start my day with that. But you have to forgive me that, yes, before our discussion, I did not do that, which means that it was a new thing for me. The idea that you actually can cover croplands with PVs.
Right. So agri-PV is a very divisive subject. Some people think it's okay. Other people think it's not okay. And there are definitely pros and cons. So the pros are it's a double use of land. So you can grow crops and you can generate electricity in the same place. And it sounds like a win-win to me. However, the farmers have some concerns about can they get their equipment around it? Will it get damaged? Will it be harmful for the biodiversity? And this has been studied. So normally the biodiversity after a couple of years actually gets better than before. So having these structures actually helps. And it has been shown that some crops actually grow better in a slight shaded environment. So you really have to match what you grow to the panels that you have. And actually we can come back to the semi-transparent panels here. So actually, we discussed silicon wafers. And normally in normal modules, you put them as close together as possible to use the space. But actually, you can space them apart. So now that you have a wafer, and then you have a bit of glass, and then another wafer. So now you allow some light to pass through to the plants underneath. But as I said, there are pros and cons. And I think in Italy, they have just moved to ban agri-PV, which is an aggressive move, I would say, considering some of the biggest agri-PV users were in Italy.
So we'll see what happens in Luxembourg. We for sure know, as you said, 10% of our land is actually human-made structures, which means 10% the one that we need for the PVs.
Yeah.
Easy calculation. You just cover all that and we're sorted.
Absolutely.
And let's leave with that. That's very nice, actually. Normally with science, you can't be just this black or white, but it's nice to finish sometimes the podcast like that.
Maybe it's not quite as black and white as we portray, but we try and give a general answer.
No, I'm actually kind of hoping that people will not go around me like those, Sunday priest you were talking about.
Yes, so I hope that people still talk to you.
Yes, exactly. And to you too as well, because, it's a common discussion we had here. So it's also on you, not only on me. Anyway, Philip, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you, Hannah.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us. If you enjoyed the episode, of course, share it with your friends. Tell others about Silux podcast. My name is Hanna Siemaszko and it was great to have you all here with me today.